The center of Kyiv. Viktor Rybalko steps out of a building accompanied by his bodyguards, the Klitschko brothers. An ordinary scene, if not for one detail. This man had survived being shot at with 60 bullets 5 years earlier. A dark car pulls up to him. From its windows emerge the barrels of Scorpion submachine guns. A burst of fire, 20 shots in just a few seconds. 3 bullets find their mark: head, stomach, thigh. One of the most influential crime bosses in the post-Soviet world collapses on the pavement just a few meters from the Opera House. Rush hour. Hundreds of witnesses. But the killers dissolve into the flow of city traffic. This is how the story ended for a man who started as a small-time burglar and died a millionaire with a Dutch residency permit. The story of a man who helped launch the careers of the Klitschko brothers and had coffee with Don King. The story of Rybalka, Viktor Ivanovich Rybalko. But it all began far less glamorously. In the mid-1970s, a young man from Baku who had relocated to Kyiv was mastering an ancient trade: residential burglary. Viktor Rybalko was born on June 30th, 1950, into a career military family, but chose a completely different path. His name was legendary in criminal circles as one of the finest locksmiths, slang for specialists in breaking into apartments. He worked cleanly, professionally, by the code. He was tried multiple times for theft of personal property, document forgery, and illegal possession of weapons. At the Kyiv Department for Combating Organized Crime, a peculiar tradition even developed. Every June 30th, on Rybalka's birthday, they would detain him and hold him for 15 days, like a ritual. In total, roughly 17 years of his life were spent behind bars. Prison is the best university for those who choose the criminal path. Behind bars, Rybalko didn't just do time. He built connections, studied the laws of the underworld, and absorbed the criminal code known as ponyatia, literally, concepts, the unwritten rules of conduct in Russian criminal culture. By the late 1980s, he was no longer just a burglar. He had become part of the system. In the late 80s, fate brought him together with Vladimir Nikulichev, known in certain circles as Pulya, the Bullet, one of the most influential Kyiv crime figures of the time. Pulya was involved in serious operations: financial fraud, racketeering, control of commercial businesses. Rybalko joined his crew and quickly proved himself a reliable man. A real friendship formed between them, not built on sentiment, but on mutual respect and shared interests. The 1990s crashed into the post-Soviet world with chaos and blood. The collapse of the USSR opened up unprecedented opportunities for those willing to take risks. The redistribution of property, privatization, and the complete absence of clear rules. A perfect environment for criminal structures. Everyone was thrown into that cauldron. Former athletes, Afghan war veterans, thieves-in-law, vor v zakone, a senior rank in Russian criminal culture, and gangsters of every stripe. Kyiv became a battlefield for spheres of influence. Every neighborhood, every market, every profitable business became an object of struggle. It was in this meat grinder that Rybalka got his chance to step into a leading role. 1992 became a turning point. In July, Chainik, the kettle, another influential Kyiv crime boss, was killed. His murder went unsolved, but in criminal circles everyone understood. It was a contract hit to eliminate a competitor. And soon after came an event that changed Rybalko's fate forever. Vladimir Nikulichev, Pulya, died in a car crash. Officially, an accident. But those who knew the score understood. The crash was staged. In the criminal world of the 90s, there were no coincidences. Having lost his friend and mentor, Rybalko faced a choice: fade into the shadows or step into the vacancy. He chose power. In the summer of 1992, multiply convicted Viktor Ivanovich Rybalko took charge of the remnants of Pulya's gang, along with fighters who had joined him from Chainik's crew. Not everyone followed Rybalka, however. A significant portion of the fighters defected to rival criminal organizations, Prishch's outfit, and the newly formed Tkach structure. But those who stayed with Rybalko formed the backbone of a serious organization. Most of them were drug addicts and people with long prior records for especially dangerous crimes, men who had nothing to lose but plenty to gain. The structure formed quickly and clearly. Rybalka had 3 deputies: Konstantin Vlasyuk, known as Chromoy, the Lame One, born in 1957, who lived on Kosyora Street, a cruel and dutiful man; Sergei Leko, Leka, born in 1959 from Chkalova Street, ambitious and cunning; and Vasily Glushko, Palich, born in 1943, registered in Obukiv but living in Kyiv's Saparnoye Pol district, the most experienced of the 3, a man of the old school. Each controlled his own area. Each had his own squad of fighters. In total, more than 200 active members served under Rybalko's command. The organization's specializations were broad and lucrative. Control over financial activity in the banking and credit sector, providing protection to banks, participating in dubious lending schemes, money laundering. Contract killings, professional, clean, without unnecessary noise. Racketeering, the classic 90s practice where every businessman paid for protection. Theft, robbery, and armed robbery, the base-level work done by rank-and-file fighters. Extortion, a special art requiring psychological pressure and shows of force. At the height of his power, Rybalko's structure controlled an entire network of commercial businesses, cafes, restaurants, and sports clubs. But there was one particular sphere of influence that surprised even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. All of Kyiv's cemeteries were under Rybalko's control. The funeral business brought in a steady income and allowed him to keep a finger on the pulse of the criminal world, because sooner or later, everyone needs to be buried. If you find the stories of criminal bosses from the 1990s, their rises and falls, interesting, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. In the comments, write which post-Soviet crime figure you'd most like to learn more about. Your engagement helps the channel grow and produce more content about the darker side of history. But simply controlling business wasn't enough. Kyiv in the 90s was an arena of constant wars for territory and influence. Rybalko had serious competitors. Valery Prishchik, known as Prishch, Pimple, with his powerful outfit; Ruslan Savlokhov and his people; Iskander Kirimov, nicknamed Tatarin, the Tatar, a representative of the Caucasian diaspora. The standoff with the Caucasian crews became one of the central threads of conflict. According to intelligence reports, Rybalko set his organization a clear objective: drive the Caucasian gangs out of Kyiv. This wasn't just a fight over markets, it was a collision of different criminal traditions, different codes, different worlds. The war was fought on all fronts. The redistribution of spheres of influence from 1992 to 1994 turned Ukraine's capital into a war zone. People were shot in broad daylight, cars were blown up, and ambushes were laid. Rybalka adhered to the thieves' code and criminal traditions, seeing himself as a representative of the classic underworld. This gave him a certain authority in the eyes of the old guard. But following the code didn't mean being soft. According to law enforcement intelligence data, Rybalko organized the murders of several criminal bosses. Vata, Bunya, Slepoy, the Blind One. All were eliminated on Rybalka's orders. Particularly significant was the elimination of rivals who had staked a claim to being arbiters in the criminal world. By removing them, Rybalko himself acquired that status, becoming the man people approached to resolve disputes, the one who handed down verdicts according to the code. By the mid-1990s, Viktor Rybalko had entered the top 5 of the most dangerous criminal figures in Kyiv. His name commanded both respect and fear. People came to him to settle conflicts. His opinion was considered when dividing territories. His word carried weight. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And the first blow came not from outside, it came from within, from the very heart of the organization. 1995 began with alarming signals. Rybalka started noticing irregularities in the financial flows. Money that was supposed to go into the obshchak, the communal fund used to finance the organization's needs, support members who were imprisoned, and pay off police officers, was either not arriving at all or arriving in reduced amounts. Rybalko investigated and reached an unpleasant conclusion. His deputies and brigade commanders were stealing from the communal fund. In the criminal world, this is the gravest violation of the code, for which there is only one punishment. The first to fall was Konstantin Vlasyuk, Kromoy. On April 19, 1995, he was found shot dead. Officially, a dispute between gangs. Unofficially, a sentence carried out. 2 weeks later, on May 5, 1995, Sergei Leka, was killed. But Leka's story is more interesting. He hadn't just been stealing from the communal fund. He was planning a coup. Leka was an ambitious man who dreamed of creating his own crew. He had strong connections with Vova Chorny, a representative of an older generation of criminal bosses, a man of great standing in the underworld. Leka was counting on Chorny's support to eliminate Rybalka and take his place. But Rybalka was faster and more merciless. The third deputy, Vasily Glushko, Palich, lasted longer. He was killed on August 8, 1997. 3 bodies in 2 years. An unambiguous message to anyone who entertained thoughts of betrayal. But the internal purges weakened the organization. While Rybalka was dealing with his own people, competitors weren't sleeping. Tensions with other criminal organizations intensified. Relations with Prisha's outfit and with structures controlled by Caucasian crime bosses were especially strained. Each side sought to expand its sphere of influence, and compromise was only reached after another string of corpses. It was precisely in those turbulent years, when Kyiv's criminal world was in constant upheaval, that an unexpected passion entered Viktor Rybalko's life: boxing. Rybalka had always loved the sport, understood its philosophy, discipline, technique, the will to win. In the mid-1990s, 2 young and promising boxers were training in Kyiv, brothers Vitaly and Volodymyr Klitschko. Sons of a career military officer, they were driven, talented, and ambitious. But talent alone isn't enough. You need money for training, travel, equipment, and promoters. And that's when a man willing to invest in their future appeared in their lives. Exactly how Rybalko and the Klitschko brothers met is not precisely known. One version has it that they were introduced by a mutual acquaintance from the sports world. Another suggests the Klitschkos were actively seeking funding and reached out to criminal circles themselves. Either way, by the end of 1995, Rybalka had become one of the brothers' sponsors. But he wasn't just providing money. He saw them as an investment project. Big-time boxing means enormous money, global fame, and connections. And Rybalko conceived a grand scheme. Rybalka had a business partner, Igor Bakay, an unusual and influential figure. Bakay held the position of head of the State Affairs Department of Ukraine, a body responsible for servicing the country's top officials. A man with connections like that, in tandem with a crime boss, was a volatile combination. Rybalko and Bakay ran joint enterprises, laundered money through commercial structures, and had a stake in Intergas. And so they decided to jointly finance the promotion of the Klitschko brothers into the global boxing arena. The plan was ambitious. Sell the Klitschko's contracts to an American promoter, take a share of their future earnings, and reach the international level. According to some accounts, the terms of the agreement between Rybalko, Bakay, and the Klitschko brothers stipulated that each party's share of the deal would run into tens of millions of dollars. These weren't just dreams. It was a business plan that had already begun to take shape. Initially, the plan was to sell the brothers' contracts to American promoter Don King, a legend of world boxing who had promoted Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, and Evander Holyfield. King was not just a promoter. He was an empire. A contract with him guaranteed success. Rybalko's criminal connections to the leaders of the post-Soviet diaspora crime organizations that had established themselves in the United States were meant to help launch the brothers' careers. In 1990s America, Russian-speaking organized crime carried serious weight, and those connections opened doors. On September 7, 1996, the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon fight was taking place in Las Vegas. Don King invited guests from Ukraine to his mansion. Viktor Rybalko came, along with Igor Bakay and Andrei Borovik, nicknamed Borovik, Rybalko's right-hand man, a fighter in his organization and a man trusted with the most sensitive assignments. And of course, brothers Vitaly and Volodymyr Klitschko. The meeting was captured on video, 10 minutes of handheld camera footage. That clip later made its way into the archive of Ukraine's Interior Ministry's Department for Combating Organized Crime, known by its Russian-language abbreviation, GUBOP, and became documentary evidence of the future world champion's ties to the criminal world. The video shows negotiations, handshakes, smiles. Don King, who himself had done time in American prisons, but had become the king of boxing promotion, discusses the Klitschko's prospects with the Ukrainian delegation. Rybalko and Borovik make no effort to conceal their presence. They feel right at home. This is their project, their investment. Photos from that trip have also survived. American scenery, King's mansion, a group of smiling people posed against a backdrop of opulence. Borovik personally took those shots. He wanted to capture a historic moment. But the deal with Don King fell through, and the decision to walk away was Rybalko's own. Rybalka considered the terms too punishing, too one-sided against his clients. He wanted to stay in control, but King was a man who was accustomed to being in control himself. In the end, the Klitschko brothers took a different path, but the initial push for their careers came from criminal capital and criminal connections. Vitaly Klitschko, when he embarked on his political career years later, went to great lengths to distance himself from this history. When journalists asked him about his acquaintance with Rybalko and the trip to Don King's home, he answered evasively, trying to change the subject. But the video footage and photographs in the GUBOP archive are irrefutable evidence. The past doesn't let go. The relationship between Rybalko and Bakay was complicated. On one hand, a partnership, shared interests, joint projects. On the other, the mutual distrust that is inherent to the world of big money and power. In 2001, Igor Bakay was showing journalists a photo album that Viktor Rybalko had sent him from Amsterdam as a birthday gift. Bakay claimed they continued to maintain a good relationship, but in criminal circles, rumors circulated that something had gone sour between them roughly 6 years before that interview, meaning in the mid-1990s. What exactly caused the rift, money, ambition, betrayal, is unknown. But those rumors would later factor into the investigation's working theories. In the meantime, in the second half of the 1990s, Rybalko continued building his empire. He was legitimizing capital by investing in legal business, cafes and restaurants, the classic method of money laundering and creating the appearance of legitimate activity. Sports clubs not only profit, but control over the youth environment and the ability to recruit new fighters. The funeral business brought in stable income without drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement. Rybalka had come to understand what many of his criminal peers understood too late, or never at all. The future lay not in thuggery and street shootings, but in legitimization, in entering politics and big business, in converting criminal capital into respectable power. But escaping violence entirely was impossible. Competitors never slept, and any day could be your last. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a crackdown on the criminal world began in Kyiv. New powers, new law enforcement structures, and political will. All of it was creating pressure on old-school crime bosses. Many were arrested, many were killed, and many fled abroad. Rybalka could feel the noose tightening, and then the hammer fell. The year 2000, the center of Kyiv, Bogdan Khmelnytsky Boulevard. Viktor Rybalko is riding in his Mercedes along with two friends. In broad daylight, hitmen pull up alongside in another car. A K-47 barrels appear from the windows. Gunfire erupts. 60 bullets. 60. The windows shatter. The metal is riddled with holes. The interior is turned into a sieve. When the shooting stops and the attackers flee, two bodies are inside the car. Rybalko's friends are dead, their bodies torn apart by bullets. But Viktor Rybalko climbs out of the car alive and unharmed. Not a scratch. Not one. 60 bullets all missed him or lodged in the seats and upholstery, but not a single one touched him. A miracle? Luck? Fate? The driver died from his injuries in the hospital. Two friends dead, and Rybalka is alive. This assassination attempt was a turning point. Rybalko understood. Kyiv was no longer a safe place for him. Too many enemies, too few allies, too great a risk. And he made the decision that many post-Soviet crime bosses made in those years, to go west, to legitimize himself, to obtain a residency permit, and to manage his business remotely. Viktor Rybalko chose the Netherlands. Amsterdam, a city with a liberal order, a sophisticated financial system, and good opportunities for money laundering and doing business. How exactly he managed to obtain a Dutch residency permit is an interesting question. Officially, he opened a business there and became a legal entrepreneur. What schemes were used, what documents were forged, who helped, all of that remained off the record. But the fact stands. By 2001, Viktor Rybalko was living permanently in Amsterdam. But even after leaving, he didn't abandon his Kyiv operation. The criminal organization kept functioning, the businesses kept running, and money kept coming in. Rybalko managed everything remotely, through trusted people and encoded communications. Modern technology allowed him to stay on top of all affairs without leaving his Amsterdam apartment. He made occasional trips back to Kyiv, usually under the pretext of visiting his mother. She had stayed behind in the Ukrainian capital in an apartment on Chokolivsky Boulevard, and her son couldn't bring himself to abandon her entirely. But every visit to Kyiv was a risk, and Rybalka knew it. He took extreme precautions. He varied his routes, gave no advance warning of his arrivals, and stayed in different locations each time. When he did come, he maintained maximum caution. Meetings? Only with vetted individuals. Movement? Only in rented cars or taxis. No regular schedules, no predictability. He understood perfectly. Whoever had organized the 2000 assassination attempt surely wanted to finish what they'd started. And 60 bullets all missing. That's not eternal luck. Sooner or later, a bullet finds its mark. Years passed. Rybalko settled into European life, made connections in the local criminal world, and integrated into the diaspora of former Soviet citizens. Life had stabilized, respectable, calm, far removed from Kyiv's gang wars of the 90s. But the threads connecting him to his homeland never broke. Business, people, debts, all of it demanded attention. And in early May 2005, Viktor Rybalko made a decision that would be his last. He was going back to Kyiv. Shortly before this trip, Rybalka had been telling acquaintances in Amsterdam something intriguing. He claimed he intended to collect $20 million from a certain individual as repayment of a debt. $20 million, a sum worth risking your life for. Who was this debtor? Rybalka didn't name him directly, but the hints were transparent enough. In criminal circles, there was an immediate consensus. The person in question was Igor Bakay. Their joint projects in the 90s, the Klitschko story, their shared business, all of it could have generated financial obligations. And by that point, Bakay was already a fugitive, wanted by Ukrainian authorities and in hiding. A man on the run being presented with a $20 million bill, an extremely dangerous combination. Rybalko flew to Kyiv in early May, the official version to visit his mother, the unofficial one to meet with a debtor and collect the money. He stayed in an apartment at 15 Ivan Franko Street, not at his parents' apartment on Chokolivsky Boulevard, but in a rented flat so as not to endanger his mother. The first few days passed quietly, meetings, conversations, sorting out the situation with the debt. But someone knew he was in town. Someone was waiting for the right moment. Someone was preparing an operation. May 12, 2005 started as an ordinary day. Viktor Rybalko decided to pick up his clothes from the dry cleaner. A mundane errand. He'd dropped off a suit. It was time to collect it. He left his apartment on Ivan Franko Street, walked to the dry cleaner, and picked up a bag of freshly laundered laundry. 4:40 p.m. Kyiv time. Rush hour in the center of the capital. Thousands of people on the streets, some hurrying home from work, some running errands, some heading to a meeting. The Opera House was 5 steps away, the Ministry of Culture nearby, cafes, passers-by, cars. Ordinary city life. Rybalko walks back toward his building, holding a bag of laundry. Dressed simply, casually, attracting no attention. A dark-colored car pulls up to him. A Daewoo, according to some accounts. The car slows. Barrels appear from the windows. A Scorpion submachine gun, a Czechoslovak weapon, compact, high rate of fire, favored by contract killers for its combination of power and size. Fire is opened. A burst, then another. The crack of gunfire shatters the evening calm. Passers-by drop to the pavement. Someone screams, someone runs. 20 bullets in a matter of seconds. This is not a warning, not intimidation. This is an execution. 3 bullets find their target, 1 to the head, 1 to the stomach, 1 to the thigh. Viktor Rybalko falls to the pavement outside the Ministry of Culture building at 19 Ivan Franko Street. The bag of laundry rolls away from his hands. Blood spreads across the asphalt. The car with the killers screeches off and disappears into traffic. Bystanders are in shock. Someone calls the police. Someone tries to help. But there is no one left to help. 54 years old. 17 years in prison survived. 60 bullets in 2000 survived. Dozens of attempts on his life survived. And this is the end. On the pavement in the center of Kyiv, holding a bag from the dry cleaner. No heroics, no romance, just a corpse in a pool of blood at rush hour. By the time the detective unit arrives, the victim's identity is established quickly. Viktor Ivanovich Rybalko, alias Rybalka, a crime boss who had been under law enforcement surveillance since the 1970s. Shell casings from a scorpion are found at the scene. Dozens, if not hundreds, of witnesses. But as always in such cases, no one saw anything. No one heard anything. No one remembers anything. Give this video a like if the criminal history of the 90s has you hooked. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Coming up, the investigation into the murder, the investigation's working theories, and shocking details. Write in the comments, who do you think ordered the hit on Rybalka? Your opinion matters. The investigation begins. The case is high profile and resonant. The public demands results. A murder of a crime boss in the center of Kyiv in broad daylight is a challenge to the entire law enforcement system. Valery Galetti, head of the Kyiv Department for Combating Organized Crime, takes personal charge of the case. An operations team is assembled, all of Rybalko's contacts are combed through, and hundreds of people are questioned. Galetti publicly states, "The murder was carried out by professionals who had been preparing for it for a long time." This was not a spontaneous gang dispute, not a random encounter. This was a planned elimination operation. There are many witnesses, but little use from any of them. Most had been hiding or running during the shooting, the natural reaction to a submachine gun burst. Someone saw a dark car out of the corner of their eye. Someone heard the characteristic crack of a scorpion. Someone noticed the vehicle as it sped off. But to describe the shooter's appearance, the car's license plate, or any distinguishing details, nobody could do it properly. Or nobody wanted to. In Kyiv in the early 2000s, people understood perfectly. Giving testimony against professional hitmen was signing your own death warrant. Law enforcement asks anyone who might help the investigation to call dedicated hotlines. Valery Galetti personally guarantees a reward and anonymity. But calls either don't come or prove useless. The criminal world goes silent. Nobody is in a rush to give up their own. Nobody wants to be a snitch. And those who know something prefer to stay quiet. Their health is worth more. But the case takes an unexpected turn. Within a few days of the murder, people start showing up at the UBOP building. Criminal bosses, arriving on their own, voluntarily. Well-known figures in certain circles come in and start proving they had nothing to do with Rybalka's murder. Some come with lawyers, some come alone. They are all questioned, their alibis verified, their statements recorded. One of the first to appear was Kyiv, a crime boss of considerable standing, a man who controlled certain spheres in Kyiv. He was actually brought into the UBOP straight from the gym. The officers didn't stand on ceremony. Kyiv presented an ironclad alibi. At the time of the murder, he was in training, confirmed by dozens of witnesses. An interesting footnote: roughly a year before his own death, Viktor Rybalko himself had been among the suspects in an assassination attempt against Kyiv. Kyiv had gotten into his car, turned the ignition, and an explosive device went off. He survived by a miracle, but the car was reduced to scrap metal. At the time, the investigation suspected Rybalka of organizing that attack. Now the roles were reversed. Kyiv was under suspicion for Rybalka's murder. But the alibi checked out. Clean. Next to be questioned was Ruslan Savlakov, brother of the late crime boss Boris Savlakov. The Savlakov family had been serious players in the 90s, and they had their own scores to settle with Rybalko. Ruslan also produced an alibi. Then came Iskandar Kirimov, Tatarin, one of the leaders of the Caucasian diaspora with whom Rybalka had fought for control of Kyiv in the 90s. Tatarin arrived for questioning on his own initiative, without being summoned, which seemed strange. Why come in if you're not a suspect? Apparently to demonstrate, I'm not involved, I had nothing to do with this. His alibi also turned out to be ironclad. All of the questioned crime bosses had airtight alibis, too perfect, as if they had known they would be under suspicion and taken care in advance to prove their non-involvement. The investigators understood. These men were too smart to personally participate in a murder. If any of them had ordered Rybalka's death, the actual shooters would be entirely different people. Hired guns who had vanished into the unknown after the job. Moscow, Odessa, Transnistria, Russia. The possibilities were endless. Valery Giletti outlined several investigative theories. The first, a connection to the 2000 assassination attempt. Those who had failed to finish off Rybalka back then had waited 5 years for the right moment and completed the job. Logical, but who were these people? The second theory, internal criminal underworld disputes. Redistribution of spheres of influence, old scores, unfulfilled obligations. Plausible enough, but with zero specifics. The third theory, the $20 million debt and the person who didn't want to pay it. This third theory was circulated most actively, though the investigation never officially confirmed it. It revolved around Igor Bakay. By 2005, the former head of the State Affairs Department was already a persona non grata in Ukraine. Criminal cases had been opened against him. He was wanted internationally. He was hiding abroad. Bakay and Rybalko had run businesses together in the 90s, had jointly funded the Klitschkos, had profited together. But then something went wrong. Some deals, some financial obligations, some debts. And then Rybalka arrives in Kyiv, announcing that he intends to collect $20 million from a debtor. And a few days later, he is shot dead. A coincidence? The media stoked this theory relentlessly. Journalists dug into the history of Bakay and Rybalko, unearthed old stories, found witnesses who confirmed, yes, there had been disagreements between them. Yes, large sums of money were involved. But proving Bakay's involvement in the murder was impossible. He was abroad, beyond the reach of Ukraine's investigators. Besides, ordering a murder and carrying it out are two different things. Bakay was smart and careful enough not to implicate himself directly. If he was the mastermind, the chain of executors was undoubtedly long and tangled, practically impossible to trace back to its source. The investigation continued for months. Investigators worked every angle, checking Rybalko's financial flows, his contacts in the weeks leading up to his death, phone records, and movements. They searched for witnesses who had seen preparations for the murder. They combed through criminal networks for leads. But the wall of silence held firm. Either the killers were truly professionals of the highest order, or they were being shielded by very powerful forces. Most likely, both. Gradually, the case began to stall. Dramatic statements gave way to vague formulations. The investigation continues. All theories are being pursued. Operational work is ongoing. The standard phrases that conceal a simple truth. The investigation had reached a dead end. The killers of Rybalka were never found. The case remained unsolved. Yet another crime boss. Yet another murder. Yet another unclosed file in the UBOP archive. And Viktor Ivanovich Rybalko was buried with the pomp befitting a crime boss of his stature. The funeral was held at Sovska Cemetery in Kyiv, the resting place of many representatives of the criminal world. The procession was impressive. Hundreds of people, dozens of cars, mountains of flowers. Those who had once worked with him, fought against him, respected him, or feared him, all came. The criminal world was bidding farewell to one of its pillars, and the Rybalka was buried exactly where he had wanted, beside the grave of Vladimir Nikulichev, Pulya, his friend and mentor, who had died in 1992. He had always told those close to him, "When I die, lay me next to Pulya." His final wish was honored. 2 crime bosses, 2 graves side by side, 2 fates intertwined in life and in death. But the story didn't end there. Viktor Rybalko's grave became one of the most striking at Sovska Cemetery. An impressive granite monument was installed. At the center stands a large cross bearing a depiction of Jesus Christ, the crucified Savior. A religious symbol, a reference to faith, to forgiveness, to the hope of redemption for the soul. Beside the cross is a full-length sculpture of Viktor Rybalko himself, realistic, detailed, as if he were standing there alive. Dressed formally, in a business style, his face serious, his gaze heavy. Such monuments were erected for many post-Soviet crime bosses, a desire to leave a legacy, to show the world, this man mattered, he was significant, he is remembered. But the most interesting detail is the inscription on the monument. The phrase carved into the granite reads, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." A quote from the Gospel, the words of Jesus Christ as he defended a woman caught in adultery from a crowd ready to stone her. A profound meaning, a philosophical message. Who is without sin? Who has the right to judge? We are all flawed. We all make mistakes. So do we really have the right to condemn others? A provocative inscription for the tombstone of a crime boss with dozens of murders, robberies, racketeering, and shattered lives to his name. But on the other hand, precisely such an inscription fits. A challenge to society, a challenge to morality, a challenge to those who consider themselves righteous. At the base of the monument is a stone bearing the surname Rybalka, spelled with an A at the end rather than Rybalko. Possibly the Ukrainian form of the name, possibly a stonemason's error, possibly a deliberate choice. Around the sculpture, floral arrangements, wreaths, bouquets, always fresh. Someone tends the grave. Someone remembers. The monument has become well known. Visitors drawn by criminal history arrive specifically to see and photograph it. The memorial to Rybalka is a landmark of Sovska Cemetery, albeit a grim one. The death of Rybalko closed one chapter of the history of Ukraine's criminal world. The 90s have passed into the past. Most crime bosses of that era are either dead, in prison, or have legitimized themselves and live quietly somewhere abroad. The new generation of criminals is different, less ideologically driven, more pragmatic, more technological. The era of thieves' codes and prison yard traditions is fading. An epoch is coming to an end. But questions remain. Who really ordered the murder of Viktor Rybalko? Was it Igor Bakay, unwilling to repay $20 million? Or one of his criminal rivals deciding to settle old scores? Or the security services, purging the criminal world of inconvenient figures? Or some combination of all these factors? The truth most likely died with Rybalka on that pavement in the center of Kyiv on May 12, 2005. The murder of Rybalko remained unsolved. Officially, the case is still open and in proceedings, but in reality, the investigation has long since hit a wall. The killers vanished. The witnesses are silent. The mastermind is unknown. A typical situation for high-profile criminal cases across the post-Soviet world. The clearance rate for contract murders of that era is dismal, a fraction of a percent. Too much money in circulation. Too many powerful people involved. Too professional the executors. Nearly 20 years have passed since that May evening in 2005. Kyiv has changed. The country has changed. People have changed. The criminal 90s and the lawless early 2000s now feel like a distant history, almost a myth. A new generation doesn't remember those days at all, when in the center of the capital people were shot with automatic weapons in broad daylight. when crime bosses divided the city into spheres of influence, when the word roof meant not a part of a building, but protection money paid to racketeers. But the memory remains. In the UBOP archives, in the files of unsolved cases, in the graves at Sovsky Cemetery, in the stories passed down by word of mouth. The story of Viktor Rybalko is the story of an entire era, an era when the USSR collapsed and new states were born, when old rules stopped working and new ones had yet to form, when everyone chose their own path amid chaos and uncertainty. Some chose honest labor and barely scraped by. Some chose crime and either grew rich or died. Some chose power and gained the opportunity to steal. Some simply tried to survive without making any grand choices at all. Rybalka chose crime. He was successful at that choice for a long time. He rose from the bottom to the top of the criminal hierarchy, earned millions, wielded influence and power, lived in Amsterdam like a respectable businessman. But the reckoning came. 3 bullets on a Kyiv pavement brought to a close 54 years of life, 17 years of imprisonment, and decades of criminal career. Igor Bakay, the figure around whom the main rumors and suspicions in the Rybalko murder case coalesced, deserves separate attention, because his connection to Rybalko was not merely an acquaintance, but a years-long partnership in which criminal activity, big business, and high politics became entangled. Bakay was born in 1954 and trained as a mechanical engineer. During the Soviet era, he built a career in party and economic structures, and with the onset of Gorbachev's reforms, known as perestroika, he found himself in the right place at the right time, at the intersection of a crumbling Soviet system and a nascent wild capitalism. In 1992, as Ukraine was only just gaining independence and forming its own state institutions, Igor Bakay became head of the main department for service to the diplomatic corps. A technical post, but with enormous potential. Under his control were real estate assets, financial flows, and contracts with foreign missions. And in 1994, he was appointed head of the State Affairs Department, the body responsible for servicing the president, the government, and senior officials. Residences, transport, security, procurement, construction, all of it flowed through the State Affairs Department. The budget was enormous, oversight minimal, and the opportunities unlimited. It was precisely during this period, in the mid-1990s, that the paths of Bakay and Rybalko crossed. Exactly how varies depending on the source. One version says a mutual acquaintance from the business world introduced them. Another suggests Bakay was actively seeking contacts in the criminal world to resolve certain problems, and Rybalka was a suitable candidate. Either way, they began to cooperate. Bakay provided cover, connections within the government, and access to state resources. Rybalka offered muscle, dealt with competitors, and ensured the security of transactions. A classic symbiosis of a government official and a crime boss, typical of the post-Soviet 90s. Together they created several commercial structures. They laundered money through shell companies. They participated in the privatization of state assets, buying up factories, buildings, and land for a fraction of their real value. They had a stake in Intergas, a company involved in gas supplies and one of the most lucrative businesses in the post-Soviet space. The gas schemes of the 90s involved billions of dollars circulating between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Those who controlled these flows became astronomically wealthy. But the most interesting joint project of Bakay and Rybalka was the promotion of the Klitschko brothers. Boxing isn't just a sport, it's an entertainment industry with enormous money at stake. A successful boxer at the peak of his career earns tens of millions per fight, and his promoters and managers receive a percentage of those purses. Bakay and Rybalka saw in the Klitschkos a gold mine. Young, talented, promising, with the right look and charisma, an ideal product for the global boxing market. According to those close to this story, an agreement was reached between Bakay, Rybalko, and the Klitschko brothers. Bakay and Rybalka would finance training, travel, equipment, and promotion. They would arrange meetings with global promoters and open the doors to the big leagues. In return, they would receive a percentage of all the brothers' future earnings. Unconfirmed accounts suggest it was a substantial share, possibly up to a third of all fight purses. Over a successful career, that would have meant tens of millions of dollars for each party to the deal. The trip to Las Vegas in September 1996 was a key moment in this plan. The meeting with Don King was supposed to open the door to American boxing for the brothers. King was not just a promoter, he was an empire. His fighters got the best contracts, the best television coverage, the best purses. Signing with King meant guaranteed success. Bakay and Rybalko understood this perfectly. But the negotiations hit a wall. Don King offered terms that Rybalka considered too one-sided. King wanted full control over the brothers' careers, the lion's share of the income, and exclusive rights for many years to come. Rybalko, despite all his criminal methods, in this case showed genuine business acumen. He understood. Sign that contract, and they would effectively hand the Klitschkos over to King for nothing, while they themselves would receive crumbs. Rybalka insisted on walking away. At the time, this decision struck many as a mistake, turning down Don King himself. But history vindicated Rybalko. The Klitschkos went a different route, found other promoters, built their careers on their own terms, and earned far more than they would have under King's umbrella. However, according to some accounts, it was precisely from this moment that relations between Bakay and Rybalko began to sour. Bakay may have regarded the rejection of King's deal as a blunder. Or there were other disagreements, over the division of revenues from other joint projects, over control of the business, over strategic decisions. The details are unknown, but rumors of a falling out between the partners started circulating from roughly 1999 to 2000. And then, the purge began. In the early 2000s, Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma decided to bring order to the state apparatus. Too much corruption, too many scandals, too much compromising material on officials. The State Affairs Department under Bakay's management had become a state within a state, uncontrolled, opaque, steeped in abuse. In 2000, Bakay was removed from his post. Audits, inspections, and investigations began. Multi-million-dollar embezzlements were uncovered, along with fictitious contracts, illegal privatization schemes, and money laundering. Criminal cases were filed against Igor Bakay. The charges were serious. Misappropriation of state funds on an especially large scale, abuse of office, and creation of a criminal organization. Bakay realized he was facing real prison time, and no small amount of it. He made the decision that many Ukrainian officials and businessmen in similar situations had made. He fled abroad. First to Russia, then, according to some accounts, to Austria or Switzerland. Places where Ukrainian justice couldn't reach him. Places where he could live comfortably on the millions he had siphoned out of the country. He was placed on an international wanted list. Interpol circulated notices. Ukraine's prosecution service sent extradition requests. But Bakay was elusive. He had enough money for good lawyers, forged documents, and the protection of powerful patrons. He had become a ghost. Everyone knew he existed, but no one could catch him. And so, in the spring of 2005, with this backdrop in place, Viktor Rybalko tells acquaintances in Amsterdam that he is going to collect $20 million from a certain debtor. He doesn't name the person directly, but from the context many understood. It was Bakay. What exactly was the debt? Several versions exist. Perhaps it was Rybalko's share from their joint projects of the 90s, which Bakay was supposed to have paid but never did. Perhaps it was the portion of the Klitschko earnings that was contractually owed to Rybalko, but that Bakay had pocketed. Perhaps it was money from gas schemes or privatization deals that Bakay had moved offshore without sharing it with his partner. $20 million. A sum worth killing a man over, especially when that man is a former crime boss with no shortage of enemies who have nothing to do with you. Rybalka's murder can be written off as a gang settling, as payback for old sins, as a fight over spheres of influence. The investigation will go digging through these theories, while the real mastermind stays in the shadows. Of course, this is all just a theory. There is no evidence of Bakay's involvement in Rybalko's murder, only rumors, speculation, and circumstantial indicators. But in the criminal world, direct evidence is rare. The mastermind and the executors are separated by several intermediary links. The order is passed through middlemen. Payment goes through fronts. The hitmen themselves may not even know who the real client is. A classic scheme, refined over decades. Bakay remains a wanted man to this day. Rumors periodically surface about his whereabouts: Moscow, Vienna, Cyprus. But officially, he remains out of reach of Ukrainian justice. Whether he is living off the money he stripped from Ukraine in the 90s, whether his conscience torments him over the possible murder of a former partner, or whether he had nothing to do with it at all, and all accusations are nothing but idle speculation, there are no answers. But let's return to the murder itself and its details. The professionalism of the executors was beyond doubt in the investigators' eyes. The choice of weapon, the Scorpion, is telling. This Czechoslovak submachine gun is compact, easy to conceal under clothing, and has a high rate of fire. It fires 7.65 millimeters or 9 millimeter rounds, depending on the variant. Its effective range is up to 50 meters, but it is typically used at much closer distances. For a city hit, an ideal choice. The choice of location, the center of Kyiv, Ivan Franko Street, rush hour, was on the one hand extraordinarily brazen. On the other, it was coldly calculated. It is easier to disappear in a crowd. Countless cars on the road meant the killers simply melted into traffic. Lots of witnesses, but in the panic, nobody retained any details. Classic professional contract killing. But what is particularly interesting? The hitmen clearly knew exactly when Rybalko would step out of the building and where he was headed. They hadn't been staking out the apartment for days. That would have been too conspicuous. They arrived precisely when the target appeared on the street. This means either mobile surveillance using multiple teams or a leak from within Rybalka's inner circle. Someone knew his plans. Someone fed that information to the killers. Betrayal? Or simply professional surveillance? Rybalko was cautious, but he wasn't paranoid. He didn't travel with bodyguards. In Kyiv, that would have attracted attention, and besides, bodyguards don't always help. It's enough to recall the dozens of crime bosses and businessmen from the 90s and early 2000s who had personal security, but were killed anyway. Professional hitmen will find their moment. Rybalka understood this and harbored no illusions. He simply hoped that his caution and unpredictable movements would give him a chance. They did not. The murder investigation was formally quite active, but produced no real results. The operations team combed through the criminal underworld, searched for witnesses, pursued theories, but every lead went cold. Witnesses remembered nothing or were too afraid to speak. Informants stayed silent. Phone taps yielded nothing. Professionals don't discuss contract murders on the phone. Financial flows were checked. No suspicious transactions before or after the killing. The weapon was never found. The Scorpion used in the shooting was almost certainly disposed of immediately after the job, disassembled, its parts thrown away at different locations or smelted down. Experienced killers never keep the weapon after a contract. The getaway car was also never found. It was most likely a stolen vehicle or one bought with forged documents, burned or sunk in a reservoir somewhere after the murder. The actual shooters were never identified. According to investigators' assessments, a minimum of 2 people were involved, a driver and a shooter, possibly 3 with a lookout. High-level professionals, possibly former military or special forces veterans of hotspots. In the post-Soviet world of the early 2000s, such men were plentiful. Afghan war veterans, Chechen veterans, veterans of the Yugoslav wars. Men for whom killing was a profession, not an emotional act. The contract for such a murder didn't come cheap. According to expert assessments of the criminal market at the time, eliminating a figure of Rybalko's standing could cost anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. A significant sum, but for someone trying to avoid repaying $20 million, a perfectly reasonable investment. A savings of 200 to 1. But the Bakay theory wasn't the only one being pursued by investigators. UBOP chief Valery Gilete also discussed other avenues. One of them was the connection to the 2000 assassination attempt. Those who organized the shooting of Rybalka on Bohdan Khmelnytsky Boulevard could have spent 5 years preparing a new attempt. They waited for Rybalka to let his guard down, for him to convince himself the danger had passed. They tracked the moment of his return to Kyiv. And they struck. Who could have been behind the 2000 attempt? The possibilities are numerous. The Caucasian gangs, against whom Rybalka had fought in the 90s. Prish and his people, with whom there were long-standing grudges. Relatives or associates of the bosses Rybalko had eliminated on his way to the top, Vata, Bunya, Slipoy. In the criminal world, memory is long and revenge is sacred. If not today, then tomorrow. If not you, then your son will avenge you. The code demands it. Yet another theory. Internal disputes within criminal structures. By the mid-2000s, many bosses of the 90s had retired, gone straight, or handed their operations over to the next generation. But Rybalko, even while living in Amsterdam, had retained control over a portion of the Kyiv business. Someone from the new generation may have decided it was time to clear out the old man and take his assets. Brutal, but logical from the standpoint of criminal expediency. And there was a theory the investigation aired with care. The order may have come from within the law enforcement or intelligence community. The purge of the criminal world in the early 2000s was not carried out exclusively by legal means, arrests and trials. Illegal means were also sometimes employed. Contract killings of inconvenient figures, staged to look like criminal gang warfare. Such methods were used in many post-Soviet countries. Convenient, effective, no need to deal with courts and lawyers. True, proving such a theory is practically impossible. Those who organize such operations leave no traces. The investigation into Rybalko's murder formally continued for several years. Reports of new leads, new witnesses, and new theories periodically surfaced in the press. But there were no real results. Gradually, the case went cold, archived among unsolved crimes. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of such cases in Ukraine from the 90s and early 2000s. Murdered businessmen, crime bosses, inconvenient journalists, accidental witnesses. The country was living through a wild period when the law didn't function and brute force and money ruled. But life went on. Kyiv was changing, rebuilding, growing wealthier. Criminal structures were transforming, fading into the background, going legit. The new generation of criminals was already different, less ideologically driven, more pragmatic, more tech-savvy. No more codes of thieves, no more prison traditions, just business, pure and cynical. Contract killings had become rare, unprofitable, attention-grabbing, reputation-damaging. Conflicts were now resolved in courts, through bribing officials, through corporate raiding, more civilized in a way. The Klitschko brothers, meanwhile, were building their careers. Vitaly became WBC heavyweight world champion in 2004 and defended the title multiple times. Volodymyr also assembled a collection of belts: WBA, IBF, WBO, IBO. They became global stars, earning millions per fight, appearing in advertisements, meeting with politicians and celebrities. Ukraine was proud of them. Two giant brothers, unbeatable, charismatic, successful. But the shadow of the past made itself felt from time to time. Periodically, those video recordings and photographs from the GUBOP archive would resurface, the Klitschkos with Rybalka and Borovich at Don King's home. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions. Vitaly answered carefully, diplomatically. It was a long time ago. We were young athletes. We were looking for sponsors. We didn't know who these people really were. Volodymyr preferred not to comment at all. Formally, their explanations look plausible. Indeed, young boxers from a post-Soviet country with no money and no connections, looking for a way through. Someone offers help. They accept, without asking too many questions. A typical situation for the 90s, when the line between legitimate business and crime had been blurred into invisibility. But there is another point of view. Critics point out that the connection between the Klitschkos and Rybalka was neither accidental nor brief. They worked together for several years. They traveled to meetings, discussed contracts, and received funding. They could not have been unaware of where that money came from and who was giving it. Some sources even claim that the brothers were not merely sponsored athletes, but actual members of Rybalko's criminal organization, serving as torpedoes, enforcers who applied physical pressure to whomever was needed. Whether this is the truth or slander is hard to say. There is no evidence, only rumors and conjecture. Regardless, when Vitaly Klitschko actively entered politics in 2014, led the UDR party, became one of the leaders of the Maidan, the popular uprising that ousted President Yanukovych, and then became mayor of Kyiv, questions about his past became especially pointed. Political opponents used the Rybalka story as leverage. Articles, investigations, and documentary films appeared, attempting to prove that Klitschko was connected to organized crime, that he was unfit to hold public office, that his past made him vulnerable to blackmail. But Vitaly held his ground. He explained that his youth had been difficult, that he had been forced to seek support wherever he could find it, that he had committed no crimes but simply pursued his sport. Voters believed him, or didn't believe him, but chose him anyway, for his charisma, his fame, his image as a self-made success. He became mayor of Kyiv in 2014 and remains so to this day. The Rybalka story became an unpleasant but not fatal episode in his biography, and the grave of Viktor Rybalko at Sovsky Cemetery continues to attract attention. Tourists come specifically to photograph the monument with its provocative inscription and post the pictures on social media. Bloggers film videos recounting Rybalka's story. Journalists write articles about the crime bosses of the 90s. The monument has become a kind of memorial to an entire era. Brutal, bloody, merciless. The inscription, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," is read differently by different people. For some, it is the cynical self-justification of a killer and a gangster. For others, a profound philosophical thought about the universal imperfection of human beings. For others still, a challenge to the sanctimonious morality that condemns some sinners while turning a blind eye to the sins of others. Each person finds their own meaning in those words. It is notable that this inscription reflects a broader trend in the culture of monuments to post-Soviet crime bosses. Many of them are decorated with religious symbols, crosses, icons, biblical quotations, as if killers and gangsters are seeking posthumous forgiveness, trying to atone for their sins through religious iconography, or simply following a fashion. In the criminal world of the 90s and early 2000s, ostentatious religiosity was popular, and it didn't interfere in the slightest with robbery and murder. Viktor Rybalko was baptized as well, and may even have considered himself a believer. Many crime bosses of that era wore crosses around their necks, lit candles in churches, and observed religious holidays. None of it made them better people, or stopped them from committing crimes. Religion was simply perceived as a cultural tradition, a part of identity, not a moral compass. You could pray in the morning and kill in the evening, without any cognitive dissonance. The memory of Rybalka is sustained not only by the graveside monument. On the internet, forums and groups exist where Ukrainian criminal history is discussed. There you can find recollections from people who knew Rybalko personally. Some write about him with respect, a man of principle who kept his word and looked after his own. Others with hatred, recalling his cruelty and ruthlessness. Others simply state the facts without emotional judgment. There are those who romanticize Rybalka and men like him, who see them as heroes, rebels, men of honor in a dishonorable world. This is a dangerous tendency, one that ignores reality. The crime bosses of the 90s were not romantic figures. They were gangsters who robbed, murdered, and ruined lives for money and power. There is no honor in that, only violence and greed. On the other hand, demonization isn't entirely fair either. Rybalko and men like him were products of their time. They grew up in the Soviet era, when the official ideology said one thing and reality was something entirely different. They witnessed the hypocrisy of the Communist Party elite, the corruption, the injustice. Then they lived through the collapse of the USSR, when all old certainties crumbled, when the law stopped functioning, when only the strongest survived. In such an environment, a criminal career was one of the few paths upward for a man without connections or higher education. This does not justify the crimes, but it explains them. Rybalko was not born a gangster. He became one as a result of choices made in specific historical circumstances. He could have chosen differently. Many did. But he chose the criminal path, and he paid the price. 17 years in prison, constant fear, a life on the run, and death on a Kyiv pavement with a bag of laundry in his hands. His story is a lesson that criminal romance is a myth, that the thieves' code offers no protection against betrayal and death, that money earned in blood brings no happiness, that power built on fear is fragile, that sooner or later the past catches up with you, and the reckoning is inevitable. 20 years have passed since the murder of Viktor Rybalko. An entire generation has grown up with no memory of those times. For them, the 90s are history from textbooks or their parents' stories. It is difficult for them to imagine what it was like to live in a country where the center of the capital could turn into a battlefield, where gangsters divided the city into zones of influence, where a contract killing cost less than a used foreign car. But memory matters. It is important to remember what was, so as not to allow it to be repeated. It is important to understand how crime is born and thrives in order to resist it. It is important to know the stories of people like Rybalko, not to romanticize them, but to appreciate the true cost that society pays for a weak state, corrupt governance, and imperfect laws. Viktor Ivanovich Rybalko, Rybalka, was part of a dark page in the history of Ukraine and the entire post-Soviet world. A page one would like to turn and forget. But we cannot forget, because that era shaped much of what exists today. The money that was stolen and laundered in the 90s is still at work in the economy. The connections built between the criminal world and those in power still make themselves felt. The people who started out in gang structures now occupy respectable positions in business and politics. History does not end with the death of its main protagonist. It continues in the consequences of his actions, in the fates of the people whose lives he changed, in the memories and lessons that can be drawn from it. Rybalka is dead, but his story lives on. And as long as the monument stands at Sovska Cemetery with its provocative inscription, as long as the Gubop archives hold the materials of the unsolved case, and as long as people are alive who remember those times, this story will continue to make itself known. Did Viktor Rybalko deserve such an end? From the standpoint of morality and law, yes, he did. A man who organized murders, ran racketeering and extortion operations, and built an empire on other people's blood cannot expect a peaceful old age. The law of karma, if you will. You reap what you sow. From the standpoint of the criminal code, he deserved it too. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. That is the rule of the criminal world, and Rybalka knew it. He accepted the risks knowingly. But from a human standpoint, no one deserves to be shot dead on the street. Even a criminal has the right to a trial, to a defense, to a fair punishment according to the law. Extrajudicial execution is a return to barbarism, to the law of the jungle. And the fact that Rybalko's murder remained unsolved, that the killers are free, that the mastermind has gone unpunished, this is a failure of the law enforcement system, a symptom of a sick society. The $20 million that Rybalka spoke of before his death, nobody ever received them. Or rather, the wrong person received the benefit. If the Bakay theory is correct, then the debtor escaped repayment at the cost of just $50,000 to $100,000 in contract fees. An economically efficient transaction, if you don't think about the moral dimension. But we don't know for certain. Perhaps the debt never existed at all. Perhaps Rybalka was bluffing, trying to appear more significant than he really was. Perhaps 20 million is a metaphor, a symbol, not an actual figure. The secret will remain a secret. The unsolved case will lie in the archive gathering dust. Witnesses will grow old and die, taking with them what they knew. Documents will be lost or destroyed. And in a few decades, the story of Viktor Rybalko's murder will have transformed into a legend in which it will be difficult to separate fact from fiction. But for now, people are still alive who remember that era. Documents, photographs, and video recordings still exist as testimony. It is still possible to reconstruct the events and try to understand what really happened back then, in the spring of 2005, on Ivan Franko Street in Kyiv. And this reconstruction matters, not to find the killers or restore justice, for that it is too late. It matters so that we, living today, might understand our history in all its complexity, its contradictions, and its tragedy. The story of Viktor Rybalko is a mirror reflecting an entire era. An era when empires were collapsing and new states being born, when old rules had stopped working and new ones had not yet formed, when everyone was choosing their own path amid chaos and uncertainty. Some chose honest labor and barely made ends meet. Some chose crime and either grew rich or died. Some chose power and gained access to corruption. Some simply tried to survive, making no grand choices at all. Rybalka, chose crime. He was successful at that choice for a long time. He rose from the bottom to the top of the criminal hierarchy, earned millions, wielded influence and power, lived in Amsterdam as a respectable businessman. But the reckoning came. 3 bullets on a Kyiv pavement brought to a close 54 years of life, 17 years of imprisonment, and decades of criminal career. Is that just? Each person must answer for themselves. The law should have judged him, not hitmen with a scorpion. But the law failed, and the criminal world passed its own verdict by its own rules. Brutal, merciless, final. A grave at Sovska Cemetery, a granite monument, a provocative inscription, flowers from those who remember, and silence. The eternal silence, broken only by the sound of wind in the branches and the occasional voices of cemetery visitors. Viktor Rybalko found his rest where he had wanted, beside his friend. Whether he found forgiveness, that is a question of faith. Whether he found justice, that is a question of philosophy. But one thing can be said with certainty. He found the end of his story, an end that was determined by a choice made many years ago when a young man from Baku decided to become a thief. This is the end of Rybalka's story, but not the end of our conversation. Subscribe to the channel, give it a like if you found this material worthwhile, and write in the comments which other stories from the criminal world you'd like to hear. There are many unsolved mysteries and forgotten names still to come, names that deserve to be told.